So please join me in welcoming Brenda Reynolds.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for asking me to come and join you again this year. But I want to also acknowledge and say hello to all the former students that are here, the many survivors that are here, and to the elders that started the conference. I want to start off by sharing with you my experience of how I got to work with residential school students, and that started 30 years ago in Gordon's, at the Gordon's Indian Residential School. It was still open at the time. That year I went there to go work there to do counseling with the residential school students because of an after-school program I had started at a school in Saskatoon. And that after-school program was working with little kids who were 8 to 10 years old. And working with them, and later finding out that they're all descendants of residential school students. And that after-school program was to teach about self-protective factors. How can you protect yourself, and how can you protect yourself and recognize abuse and the different types of abuse that are out there. And then who do you trust? Who can you trust with your secrets if anything happened to you? And so this is what I presented to the residential school. And they agreed that I could do counseling with students that were attending the school. And it was different. It was really shocking for me when I went there, because I didn't go to residential school. I grew up on a reserve in I would say Saskatchewan because I'm somewhere else, but I grew up in Fishing Lake is the name of the reserve I grew up in. And I used to see the yellow buses that would come and pick up the kids every fall. And this silence, this loneliness, this grief in the community would happen right after the yellow bus would come, because the yellow bus wouldn't return with the kids for many, many months. And so I didn't know as a child where these kids were being taken to for extended periods of time until I went to Gordon's. And it was really shocking to see that the kids had numbers. And I didn't know that they had numbers to identify them. And that was the first time, and the food wasn't really good. And this was back in 1988, so it's like 30 years ago. And that was the first time that I ate bologna, was there. They fried it up with onions, and didn't know what the heck it was, because I didn't have that when I was growing up. I grew up with wild game, and my grandfather and dad had cows, and so we ate that kind of stuff. So we didn't have anything that was processed in that regard. But it was during that year that I spent with the students that I learned so much about loss. When we're talking about grief and loss, that was where my experience started, was listening to the kids talk about their losses of their parents, and how it hit them as kids. And yeah, like some of them played in sports, but there were still all the feelings that were attached to the loss. And then one night, that one beautiful night in June, 2 weeks before the end of the school year, one girl came up to me. She was 13 years old, and she wanted to talk to me. She wanted to talk to me, and I said, I'll meet you in a few minutes. I have to finish eating, and I'll meet you. And then she came with 2 other friends, and they disclosed to me that they were being sexually abused by one of the staff members. And I knew the staff member because when I first arrived, I spoke to him about how it was inappropriate to be alone with the female students, that he was always putting himself into those situations. And so, in addition to listening to the first girl talk about her experience, I told her I had to call the police, and I had to report it to the supervisor of the residential school. And so the constable arrived, and we set up and to take a statement from the disclosure from the first girl. And we finished that first disclosure, and then opened the door to let her out, for her to go back to her dorm. And there was another girl standing there. 17 times that night that happened. 17 disclosures of little girls talking about the sexual abuse that they had been experiencing for the years that they had been there. The 13-year-old had been there since she was 6 years old, and the abuse started shortly after she arrived. And so that was how I started working with loss and started working with students at the time, because they were still, Gordon's was still in operation. But what happened that night changed. It changed for, now look at all of us sitting here. It changed, it really, really changed a lot, in a lot of ways. Those 17 girls, those charges that were laid against that former staff person, that was the first charge in Saskatchewan. The first charge of sexual abuse on kids attending residential school. And so that was the first wave of litigation that started in Saskatchewan, started by those 17 little girls. They're all students attending school at the time. And it's interesting that we're talking about Indian residential schools and resolution to reconciliation and reconciliation to do our work and our workplace and our communities and our families. And I always get reminded of how I first started was with those 17 girls. And shortly after those 17 girls, it got really, really unsafe, because I started getting threatening phone calls and started to get threatened by others, by adults. And like, how dare I teach kids to talk about stuff like this? How do I dare talk to them about sexual abuse and how to protect themselves, and I don't know what I'm doing, and that kind of stuff. And it got to be really unsafe. And so, not only unsafe for me, but there are some situations where it wasn't safe for me when I had my little kids with me. And for my own safety and for my safety of the family, we left. I had to leave. And I moved to Alberta, and Alberta has been home since then. Without knowing that Alberta had the highest number of residential schools in Canada. And the community that I went to, I didn't know had one of the highest numbers of schools in Alberta around that location. So I went from working with students that went to working with former students and the impacts. And again, continued to work with the losses. And little did I know what was going to happen with that night that happened with those 17 girls. I would get phone calls from students and from former students and saying, like, if these little girls can talk, if these young kids can talk about their experiences, I can talk about my experience. And what do I do? How do I find support? All that kind of stuff. And so that was the beginning of working with people to find their truth and to talk about their loss, and how do they find meanings in their lives, and how do they move on to be resilient from the abuses. And in addition to that night, I would have never, ever thought in a million years that those 17 girls were going to lead to what has become the largest class action lawsuit in Canada, the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement. And then, of course, we went through the different components, and one of those components was the Truth and Reconciliation, where we talked about reconciliation as we moved across the country and gathering statements and listening to people's experiences and how it left them in their lives. And so it is, from there is I want to start with that is leading to how, when we're talking about loss of any kind, the way that we respond to it, grief is a natural response to loss. And sometimes when we respond to grief and the enormity of that grief, it could be really overwhelming. And then we think that we're abnormal for feeling the way that we're feeling. And actually the way that you're feeling is absolutely normal. And it feels abnormal to us when we haven't, as kids, have always been taught a safe way to express and feel our feelings through different kinds of loss and happiness as well. And there's also different kinds of loss as well. There's losses related to relationships, related to pregnancy, when there's a loss of an unborn child, and children leaving home, whether it's voluntarily or involuntarily. Voluntarily meaning that there's been a separation in the family, and the children, there's an agreement that the children will live wherever it is that they're going to live. Involuntarily, of course, is what it is that we have seen within our communities of children leaving and this has been going on for more than 150 years within the Indigenous community. First, when they were taken to attend residential schools, and then in the 60s, when the agreement started with the provincial governments where child welfare was going to be delivered on reserves, and so children started getting apprehended starting in the 60s. And so there's the involuntary leaving. And then, of course, from there, too, we have the 60 scoops, because some of them were taken outside of Canada and outside of Saskatchewan. I almost said Alberta because I had a little flash for a moment. I was in Alberta. And so leaving home and the loss that happens, the degree of loss that happens when that happens, and we'll talk more about that. And, of course, death. Death, we don't talk enough about what happens to us when we experience death, and death being final, and we have to find ways to grieve that loss. And death is a part of our life cycle that we don't talk enough about in our families. And I had an experience with the loss of a loved one, and he's been gone for almost 10 years now, and he was my partner when he died. And I had, prior to that, had worked with so many people regarding grief and loss, and it was in that time of my own experience with my own loss that I feel how physically impacted you can be when you have a loss. You feel exhausted because of all the feelings that you're feeling all the time. And then the anxiety that you can feel that accompanies the feelings when they come and you're immersed in those feelings. And how do you find a resolution to that, and how do you find peace with that? Another loss that we don't typically hear of, and which is ambiguous loss. And this happens in our communities a lot, meaning our Indigenous communities. And ambiguous loss, there's two kinds. There's a physical and there's a psychological. The physical is when a person goes missing, and we don't know where they are, we don't know what happened to them, and there's no, like now we always hear about missing and murdered women and children and girls and men, and so this is what this relates to, is when they go missing, and there's nothing final, because when we experience a loss through death, you have, as a family, an opportunity to have a service, to have a funeral service, and then you have your rituals that go along with the death in that regard. But when a person goes missing, you don't have that opportunity, and yet you have a deep, deep loss that's related to the unknown. And so that's what the ambiguity relates to, physical loss. And the psychological loss is referred to when you're here physically, but you're not here mentally. You're not here with your mental state. And it could be, we see this a lot, I see this a lot in the communities that I've worked in with addictions. People are engaged in their addictions, or they're physically, but they're not there psychologically, because they're always forever chasing whatever substance it is that they're addicted to. And then it can also be related to dementia, Alzheimer's, like that kind of, like some kind of diseases like that. And then also I've added in here too is that work. If sometimes some of us are so busy with our work, when we come home, we're still working. We're on the we're on our devices all the time. We're here physically, but we're somewhere else. And so we're not engaged within our families. And so it takes a lot of mindfulness to be present all the time. So those are the different kinds of losses it is that I'll be talking about. And then also to the psychological and the physical, the ambiguous loss relates to residential schools. The reason why it relates to residential schools is that you were physically taken and removed from your families. Psychologically, they would be at home with their families and within their communities. And so they themselves were not psychologically present at the residential schools that they were attending. They were away somewhere else. And sometimes that could be a good thing, but in this case, it really, in terms of feelings, learning how to feel your feelings and how to cope, those were all impacted because of the lack of supports that were given in the residential schools. And of course, the age, support, and understanding the loss all contribute to how you cope and how you find meaning to the new normal in your life. And I call it a new normal is that because we're always in situations where our life is changing. And so how do we adapt to that change? And how do we shift and get stabilized when our ground is moving? And we're shifting all the time, and how do you find stability and still be resilient and move forward and learn from whatever experience it is that you've had? And feelings in response to your loss. It's like I was saying earlier, with when you're a child, it's such an important time in our life to be learning about our feelings and to be able to express our feelings and how do you cope in different situations. And so it's really important and because those things impact us later on in life. And in addition to the different kinds of loss, there's also different kinds of grief and how we respond to that grief. Some of the losses that are different and how we respond to them are, of course, the death that I had spoken about, but suicide. We have a high incidence of suicide in our communities. And when someone dies by suicide, sometimes the parents they feel shame for the way that the person died. And it isn't spoken, but it's felt. And so the way that you find resolution and peace with that is different. And so it's different. You grieve different when it's suicide. You grieve different when there's been an accident. Because when you know that if someone is ill, you have an opportunity to go and make peace with that person. Whether you thank them for whatever it is that they have given to you in your life and how it is that they had influenced you. And it brings a different kind of loss experience when you have that opportunity. I've had the honor of working with many, including my deceased husband, with walking them to the end of their life. And I've also worked with people who have had opportunities to go and talk to people who were ill to rebuild relationships or find some way to repair what had happened in their relationship. So that kind of a loss is different. And when you have a loss that is unexpected, whether that unexpectancy is related to an accident or whether they've had a massive heart attack or something like that where it's totally unexpected, there's a different grief response to that. You grieve in a different way because, again, you haven't had that opportunity to say goodbye to them or that you love them or whatever it is that you felt. It's a different response to that. And again, missing and murdered, and there's that ambiguity that happens with that. And what I've seen when there's been murder, a person has died related to a murder, is that there could be hate and revenge, a lot of difficult feelings in regard to that loss are experienced. And in addition to those experiences, that sometimes there's guilt when you have a loss as well, a guilt that's related to the loss. The guilt could be when somebody is ill and has been ill for an extended period of time, and you start feeling like you start praying that something happens to them, and that sometimes could be death that comes to them so that they can get some relief from their disease, from their illness. And so what I've heard from some people sometimes is the guilt that they had prayed for that person to leave. And so that always needs some kind of resolution as well. And so what happens to us when we experience a loss, especially a significant loss? And our bodies are just absolutely, absolutely amazing because they have self-protective factors in us. When we experience a loss and that shock, we experience an anesthetic to numb us. So because if we were to experience all that grief at one time, it would be really, really difficult. And so when we experience our grief, it comes in waves. But in the very beginning, it's numbing when you first start feeling it. So it's a self-protective factor that we have in our bodies. And each person's grief journey is really different. We can all be in this room, we're all in this room, and every single one of us will have a different experience if we had lost if we experienced the same loss. And because it's unique, because it's our relationship with that individual. And our relationship varies with that individual or to that experience. So we're all going to have a unique experience. And one of the communities that I work in, we had, in a period of 12 weeks, we had 16 deaths. And then in response to that, I was seeing a lot of people individually. And so what I did is I started a grief support group. And because it's a smaller community, and of course everybody's been impacted by all the losses, every single one of us has a different response to each loss. And it's always amazing on how you get the full picture of a person by learning what everybody's experience was. My dad died 4 years ago at the beginning of this month. And he was a wonderful, wonderful man. He was really friendly. And he always talked to people. He told jokes all the time. And I remember the time of the funeral, there was a lot of people that attended his funeral. And I went and thanked people for coming. And I asked them, what was your relationship with my dad? And it was amazing. It was absolutely amazing to hear all the stories of why it was important for them to come to his funeral because of the way that he had impacted them and because of their relationship with him. And so that is an example of how everybody's relationship and their loss is impacted in a different way. And our journey is all unique and related to us. And I just want to speak a bit about anxiety because it relates to the feelings. When we have loss, when we experience loss, it's overwhelming. It's very, very overwhelming, and some people sometimes can't manage how overwhelming it is. And then they will experience anxiety. And I remember when I first started, I didn't hear about a lot of people experiencing anxiety as I do now. And I think that from my own experience, what that has been is that because the ones that I see it in are the ones that have been impacted intergenerationally by residential schools, or they grew up in foster care, and so they didn't have the teaching of a consistent caregiver to teach them about anxiety. All of us have fear. Anxiety is related to fear, and every single one of us have fear, and to different things. And the other part of where the anxiety is experienced is also when we don't know or how to name our feeling that we're feeling because of the loss. And so anxiety can come upon us. Our hearts can start going, and we can start sweating and everything else. And that's related to the fear and, of course, the anxiety. And the anxiety is because it's fear-based, is that your body is responding to whatever it is that you're feeling the loss to, right? And I can tell you about a few times I had experienced this after Jim had died. Jim was my husband, and the pain was so intense of how much I missed him, and I couldn't imagine him. I couldn't imagine myself going forward, because he has been in my life for days and days and years, and how was I going to live without him? And I remember falling to the ground for the intensity of the emotion that I was experiencing. And I remember laying there, feeling it, and just feeling the waves come, the feeling of loss, and just being overwhelmed by the loss of him not being present. And I was probably having anxiety, but I didn't know it at the time, because what I've learned how to do with anxiety is going with it. For those of you that have gone swimming in the lakes and waters, you know how you feel the waves and you're bobbing up and down. And that's the same thing with anxiety, is to go with it, because your body is having a big gush of adrenaline. Our brain, from the front part of it, is telling us that there's some kind of danger going on, and our adrenals go, and then they start pushing all of this adrenaline into our bodies, and then it makes our heart go faster. It was like how we used to respond long time ago to if we were being chased and that kind of stuff, the fight, freeze, or flight response that our bodies have. And so what happens when people feel the anxiety is that they put the brakes on it. And when you put the brakes on it, then you're starting to think, oh my gosh, I'm having a heart attack, and your mind starts going. That's the fear that you have. And so what you do is that you stop that and you think, no, I can handle this, I'll be okay. And you will be okay. And you just go with it. You go with the feelings, and the anxiety goes, and then sometimes I have to shake it off because the adrenaline leaves you shaky and that kind of stuff. So that's the kind of response that I see a lot of people have when they have some loss experiences. And mindfulness. The thing that has happened with us traditionally is that I remember when I was growing up on my reserve, I used to hang out with my dad all the time. If I wasn't with my dad, I'd be with my grandfather. And I used to go with my dad when he used to go hunting. And that experience as a child of going hunting with him was really, really such another gift from him. The reason why it was a gift from him is that he was teaching me how to be mindful. And when you're a hunter and are on the land, you will know what it feels like when you're just totally at peace. And just as that you're attuned to yourself, to, if you're hunting, not to be making noise, because if you step on a twig, it's going to alert if there's any animals that are there. And so mindfulness is being present in your mind all the time, and being present to your feelings and being present to your surroundings. And when one of the other things that I did at the beginning of the settlement agreement, excuse me, I'll just have a drink here, is I was asked in 2007, Health Canada was named as one of the parties in the settlement agreement to be providing health supports to former students and family members and later Canadians. But they didn't know how or what the program was going to look like, so I was asked to develop a pilot. And so I developed the health support program, which is now provided to former students all across the country. And in my training of the health supports was that in addition to being mindful, one of the things that mindfulness is when you're being present and you're listening to people, is that we had to learn how to listen. And because when you're going through a loss process, it's important to have a grief buddy. I call them grief buddies. And so when you're going to someone and you want them to listen to you, And so what we used to do is that we used to have some role plays of how to listen to each other. Because, and you probably know this, when you came in through the doors this morning, and maybe even now as I'm talking, you're probably thinking, oh my gosh, I need to go to Safeway to go get something for dinner tonight. I don't know what I'm going to be cooking for dinner and that kind of stuff. Or I'd really like to go to Tim Hortons instead of sitting here listening to her talk about this stuff. Or I left home and I didn't like the way that I started my day. I had an argument with my spouse, or I yelled at my child. All those different experiences. Those things could be going on in your mind right now as I'm talking to you. And so imagine yourself being in a position where you're talking to somebody and you're talking about your grief. And in our situation, we were talking to a former student's truth about their experiences. So really talking about a lot of trauma. And when you're talking to someone, you want them to be present. You want them to be here with you, listening to you. Not talking about in their mind about going to Walmart, going to Safeway and all that kind of stuff, or thinking that, oh, I have something to tell her. Oh, now she's moved on, so I guess I can't talk about that now. I can you're thinking of something else, right? You're not present in your mind. And you think that because you're not present in your mind, that you're not mindful, is that the person that you're listening to doesn't know that. But your body says that. Your body language absolutely expresses if you're present with a person or if you're not present with a person. And we had that happen lots of times. And so we role played that. And so it's really important to find somebody who's going to be listening to you and being present to you and being a support to you. And where they're not judging you. Sometimes when you could the things that a person says to you in regard to your loss, it comes from their good intentions, but the way that they say it could come across as being very judgmental. And like I remember one of the times that I was getting home, and this was, I don't know, maybe a few months after Jim had died. I was walking along the parking lot, and one of the guys in our building came and said, oh, I heard about Jim, and I'm sorry about him. And he said, I'm really sorry that it happened to him. And I thought, like, what do you mean, like, what happened to him, you know? And I said, well, buddy, it's going to happen to you and I too. We're going to die. You know, like, it's just the way it is. We're all going to die. He didn't go and have an unfortunate accident or anything like that. This is something that's going to happen to us. But sometimes the things that people say to you in response to a loss could be really surprising, you know, and it can come across as judgment, whether it comes by the tone of your voice. And I'll give you another example that I just always love to share, because she was one of my favorite receptionists in an office that I worked in. And she had really, really good intentions. And just was really good after you got through the abrasiveness of how she said hello to you. And and I had to call her into my office because I was getting complaints about her, right? And then she goes, well, Brenda, I care about these people. And I said, well, that doesn't show to me that you care if you're yelling at me and moving and shaking, right? And say, like, can you say that softly and present it better, right? Because when you're having someone tell you that, I love you, just listen to me. Like, how convincing is that when you're just tearing up inside, right? They're not congruent, they're not the same, they don't match. So it's always really important to think of what it is that you're saying and how you're presenting it. Again, being really mindful of your voice. And because when someone is trusting you with their heart, that is a gift, an absolute gift, that someone is opening up their heart to you. And so we have to learn how to treat that gently and how to treat it with care, just like how we would want to be treated when we're in that situation. And of course, the support that is so meaningful. And when we talk to others for support, what happens in that time is this transformation happens. And what I do is I tell people just to go, and this was from my own experience too when I've had loss, is is I would go and say, so what was your experience? Tell me what you did. It was so important to find out my experience was a normal response to what was going on. And because sometimes we think that we're going crazy after we've had a loss, and we don't know if it's a normal experience, a normal response. So it's really good to go to someone and say, tell me what it is that you did when you felt like this, or did you even feel like this? And so when that sharing happens, your trust building and your relationship building, and to have somebody walk beside you and teach you about what their loss is amazing. And to remember that just because someone asks us to find out what your experience was, doesn't mean that I'm obligated to take that and duplicate what it is that you have done. So when we share our experiences, it's giving without the ties, disconnecting it and giving it as a gift, a true gift, without having to say, like, hey, wait a minute, I told you this and you didn't do it, and come back here, you're not healing in the way that you should be healing. And then in these opportunities is that when we find resilience, when we start talking about how other people have responded to their loss, we find out that, hey, I know how to do that. Because when you're in that period of loss, you don't always know how resilient you are. And for us as Indigenous people, like, we are pretty darn resilient. When you think of all the things that we have been through individually and collectively, when we've gone through residential schools, when we've been taken off our lands and put into reserves. And I remember the past system when I was growing up on my reserve. My dad had to go to the Indian agent and go get a little slip of paper for us to go to the auction market and that kind of stuff. So residential schools and the children being taken through child welfare, like, we just go on and on and on with all the stuff that we have been through as people. So we're pretty darn resilient. But when you start looking at your own resilience, you will be amazed at how resilient you are. And sometimes we don't give ourselves credit for how resilient we are and how we have been able to adapt and go through all the different life opportunities and have come out on the other side. It's absolutely amazing. So it's also really important to look at that, of how resilient you are. And it not only does it take you to a new normal, but it takes you to another level of confidence, and it builds you. It builds you up when you feel that, hey, like, I've done this, I could do this, and I'm going to be okay. I just will need some help with that. And in our loss, it always, I've seen this many, many times, where because of our loss, and I said this, that we've shifted and we seek new meaning to our loss. What does this person mean to me? And what is it that I have to do? What am I going to do now? And the new meanings, the searching for the new meaning doesn't happen immediately. It happens after some period, after some time. And again, this happens when you start talking to others. And I've seen this with former Indian residential school students talking about when those little girls started talking about their sexual abuse, they felt alone, and they were the only ones that were going through that. Little did they know that there were other kids who were experiencing the same thing. So then you start building a community where there's been common experiences, and then you know that you're not alone in this. And then that's how you build resilience and gain strength, is like knowing that you're not alone in this. And I remember when I first started working with people, they would always say, and there's been a big shift in this now, is that don't cry because you're going to be holding the other person back. And then I started hearing voices of the people who have been experiencing loss of different kinds, and finding out that this one lady, she shared her experience with us in group one time about how she was in bed at nighttime crying. She was lonely. She was lonely for her parents. And she knew how to cry silently by this time, but her body would still move, and she cried silently because she didn't want to be heard and get into trouble with the supervisor in the room. Is that somebody came to her, one of the other students came to her, and they whispered, and that girl told her, like, I miss my mom too. I feel lonely too. And they would share that, right? And she said it was that night that the Creator came to them and told them that they weren't alone. So they had an experience with relationship building between the two of them as little girls, but she also remembers that night being a significant night for her, knowing that there is something else higher than us, a belief that is higher than us. And she talks about that, and I've heard similar stories many times. In relation to spirituality, is that when we have a loss, and I'm referring to specifically in death or someone that has gone missing or somebody that was murdered, is that sometimes we think that we have spiritual visits. We experience spiritual visits. I know one time I was sleeping and I felt the bed move. And I felt the bed move, and in my mind, in my heart, I felt that Jim came to sit beside me on the bed. And I just felt his presence. And when I woke up, of course, he wasn't there. And so it wasn't that I was having a crazy nightmare. I actually experienced that. And I have heard many, many, many people that have had spiritual visits and how their faith and spirituality has come. But also, on the opposite side, there's also a period of time when you absolutely hate the Creator and God for the loss that you experienced. And so both of those experiences do happen. And this picture that I have here is of a prayer box on top of a mountain in Hawaii that we went on a hike on, and I just thought it was absolutely fitting to see this prayer box on top of a mountain of putting your prayers, and it's getting closer to Creator. And when out of all the experiences with loss, the spiritual visits, I always find them really, really interesting. And how, because like I've left my own community and have worked in other communities and have worked with other tribes and have learned of some of the rituals that come along with it. And some of the rituals that are practiced in some of the different tribes and communities, and how they find ways of staying connected to their loved ones through spirit and through different ceremony and through different rituals. And I always find that really interesting. And it's because what happens with our loss is that we lose our physical relationship, and so our relationship shifts into another kind of relationship. It becomes into a spiritual relationship. And so to have some kind of spiritual or religious practices fit with our relationship, our renewed relationship with the person it is that we've lost. And in leading to this, Lee goes into the grief buddies. How do we find a grief buddy? I remember my little cookum on my reserve, and she used to always say, Wicihitowin, help each other. And this is what a grief buddy is, to help each other through a difficult time in your life. And sometimes that grief buddy isn't going to be there for a long time, but they could be there for a long time as well. They could be there just only to help you through a specific period of time. I remember when Jim died, he left me names of two of his friends. Both his friends had lost one. Her husband had died. Her husband had died, and his wife had died. And I used to call them, and that was the only time that they were briefly in my life, was during that time when they were helping me through a really difficult period of time in my life. So Wicihitowin, help each other, listen to each other, don't be judgmental. And And the other thing is, sueminak, love each other. Always love each other. Come from a position of love. You'll never go wrong if you come from a position of love. And speak from a position of love, not speaking with a loud voice. And because sometimes they may not look like love when you're talking to someone with a loud voice like that. And sometimes what happens to our grief is that we have either perceived or real barriers. And those barriers are around us. And we don't get to the other side of finding out who we are, of how we can become in this new normal as a result of a loss that we have. And sometimes there's hate and revenge related to a loss. And that loss, it could be in relationships. I've seen this a lot in relationships where there's hate and revenge in a couple when they separate. And they don't remember the little kids it is that they're hurting because of the separation. And that separation is causing some harm to the kids. And so it's to find ways to be calm and to find ways to have your heart open to seeing the individual that you're in this separation now, where you're not so hateful. And so it's taking small steps to be understanding the source of what it is that has happened. I'll share with you one story that happened when we were going through hearings in Alberta leading to the last national event. Because I was the regional coordinator of the health supports in Alberta, and I would get calls from people from all over the place. And we were having a hearing in one community, and it was a former staff member. And he was angry. And he was saying that all the experiences that former students are talking about didn't happen, that staff had good intentions and all that kind of stuff, and that he was going to go to the hearing and make sure that was heard and that was known. So lots of hate, and he had thoughts of revenge. And the day of the hearing comes, and we've got registration going, and I'm walking along, and I've spoken to this person for 3 weeks straight. One time I listened to him for 5 hours straight, and so I recognized his voice. I didn't know his name because he never ever shared his name with me, but I recognized his voice, and then I went to behind the person that was taking registration, and I saw his name. And I told one of the health supports, a couple of the health support leads, to pay attention, and so that we can provide support to this individual and to support all the other people that were going to be impacted by the hate and the revenge that he had. And so all day I kept on watching for him to see if he was going to go and speak and that kind of stuff. And then it was time to close, but then at the end we still had 52 people that were not heard, and so we set up another circle for them to share their experience. And he was one of those, and he said, I came here today to talk about how angry I was. And he said, but after sitting here all day, he said, I've changed. It's changed me to, I didn't know what the experiences of what those little kids were going through at the school that I worked at, when they were being told that they were worthless, that they were nobody, and of the abuses that they had and the awful food that we fed them. And he was talking about all what he had done and how he would beat sometimes the kids that he was working with. He said, if I had known what the end result was going to be for those kids when they were adults, he said, I wouldn't have done that. I wouldn't have done that. I would have been kinder to them, he said. But so what happened to him is that his heart melted. He was no longer hateful or had wanted to be revengeful. After listening to the other side of the story and coming to an understanding of what the experiences of the kids were, is that his heart opened up and became to a place of some sort of understanding that would hopefully have led him on to some resolution at some point. But sometimes we put these barriers in front of ourselves just so that we we don't move on from that. And so it could be a barrier for us to not leave on. The mystery of life and death. Part of the loss always comes the mystery of life and death. We don't know the answers all the time, and it's okay not to know all the answers all the time either too. And so lastly, what I want to do is I want to close off with children and grief. And the reason why I want to close off with children and grief is because with the residential school experiences, as horrific as those experiences were, is that the kids that before they went to residential schools had an opportunity to attach. They had an opportunity to attach to a significant person in their life, whether it was their mother, their father, their grandfather, whoever their caregiver was. And the difference is happening now is what we have babies who are being apprehended at birth and put into homes and multiple homes. And what happens is that each time that they get moved, there's less attachment, even if that's assuming that there was attachment. So I see ourselves in terms of the little kids that I work with now in worse condition mentally, emotionally, and psychologically than the residential school students I worked with 30 years ago. And that's the sad part. And what happens with kids is that when they have the loss, they experience the same loss that we have as adults. But the things with them is that they don't express it verbally. They express through play. Sometimes they regress. Their behavior can regress sometimes. And so play is really important for kids, for them to express their feelings, to express their loss. And play is also important because of what it does to relationship building. If I'm talking and playing with my grandchild or one of my kids, is that you can play and talk with them on a phone. You could play and it leads to better brain development. It leads to education opportunities. And one of the projects that I've done this a couple of times, is that because of the situations I have seen kids and the grief it is that they have gone through, whether through losses of death or losses of homes and losses of different relationships, is that, and then the poverty that exists. I've seen kids from where there's extreme poverty, where they have nothing, and it's understandable that parents aren't going to buy toys for them because what are you going to do, buy food or a toy? Obviously, you're not going to be buying toys when you have to buy food. And then we have kids on the other side where there's a lot of, parents are working, but there's electronics. And so when I was talking about ambiguous loss being related to psychological loss, the kids aren't present. And so our kids now are not learning how to play. And so what I've done is that I've worked with different churches where we've gathered toys that are according to the developmental age of the child, and so that we can teach them how to play. But the other component to that is teaching the grandparents, parents, whoever the caregiver is, on the importance of play. And what happens to them is that we don't think of play was being disrupted in the residential schools, but it was. Kids in the residential school didn't play. There weren't any toys. And so what happens when they come to parent is that the little kids are not learning how to play. And that is so important for the development and to teach them how to cope with their feelings of potential loss in their lives as well. And so if you want more on that, my email address, if you want to talk about how you could do that, is there. And I just want to say thank you again. I had to kind of rush towards the end there. And I want to give photo credit to my little 2-year-old grandson that took this picture. Thank you. Yeah, he's a really good little photographer.